The scorching sun beat down mercilessly on the dusty town of Copper Ridge, Arizona Territory, in the summer of 1887. The wooden gallows stood like a grim sentinel in the center of the town square, its shadow stretching across the parched earth where two young figures knelt with nooses around their necks. Samuel, barely 16, and his younger brother Thomas, just 14, trembled as the hostile crowd gathered around them. Their eyes filled with a thirst for frontier justice that had already decided their fate. The accusations rang through the air like gunshots horse thieves. They called them criminals who had stolen the prized stallion of the town's most influential citizen, Judge Cornelius Blackwood. But as the executioner prepared to pull the lever, a lone horseman appeared on the horizon, kicking up a cloud of dust that would forever change the destiny of these two orphaned souls. Little did anyone know that this moment would unravel a web of deceit, corruption, and murder that had plagued Copper Ridge for years, and that the real criminals were hiding in plain sight among the very people demanding justice. The Whitman brothers had arrived in Copper Ridge 3 weeks earlier, their worn boots and tattered clothes telling the story of countless miles traveled on foot after escaping from the brutal conditions of St. Augustine's orphanage in neighboring New Mexico territory. Their parents had perished in a cholera outbreak when Samuel was 12 and Thomas was 10, leaving them to navigate a world that showed little mercy to parentless children. The orphanage had been their prison for long years, where cruel overseers and meager rations had taught them that survival meant relying only on each other. When they finally summoned the courage to flee, they had nothing but the clothes on their backs and a shared dream of finding honest work and a place to call home somewhere in the vast expanse of the American frontier. Copper Ridge had seemed like a beacon of hope when they first glimpsed its wooden buildings and bustling main street, but they would soon discover that this town harbored secrets darker than the desert nights. Their first mistake had been trusting Deputy Marshal Jake Morrison, a heavy-set man with kind eyes who had found them sleeping in the livery stable on their second night in town. Morrison had taken pity on the brothers, offering them odd jobs around his property in exchange for meals and a place to sleep in his barn. For 2 weeks, Samuel and Thomas had worked diligently, mucking out stalls, chopping firewood, and helping Morrison's wife, Martha, tend to her vegetable garden. They had begun to believe that their luck was finally changing, that they might have found the stability they had always craved. But their hope would prove to be as fragile as morning frost in the desert, shattered by an accusation that would threaten to end their young lives before they had truly begun to live them. The trouble started on a Wednesday morning when Judge Blackwood discovered that his prized Arabian stallion, Thunder, had vanished from the secure paddock behind his mansion on the hill overlooking the town. Thunder was no ordinary horse. The magnificent black stallion had been imported from Kentucky at considerable expense, and was worth more than most families in Copper Ridge would see in a lifetime. Judge Blackwood was not a man to be crossed. He controlled the local government, owned the largest ranch in the territory, and had connections that reached all the way to the territorial capital. When he demanded answers, people listened, and when he demanded justice, people obeyed without question. Within hours of discovering the theft, Blackwood had organized a search party and offered a substantial reward for information leading to the recovery of his horse and the capture of the thieves responsible. The accusation against the Whitman brothers came from an unexpected source, Ezra Hutchins, the town's blacksmith, who claimed to have seen the boys leading a black horse out of town just before dawn on the morning Thunder disappeared. Hutchins was a respected member of the community, a man whose word carried weight in the court of public opinion, and his testimony seemed ironclad. He provided specific details about what he had witnessed, describing how the boys had appeared nervous and had quickly looked away when he called out to them from his workshop. Several other townspeople came forward to support Hutchins' account, claiming they too had noticed suspicious behavior from the orphans in the days leading up to the theft. The evidence seemed overwhelming, and Judge Blackwood wasted no time in issuing warrants for their arrest. Samuel and Thomas were seized while working in Deputy Morrison's barn, their protests of innocence falling on deaf ears as the angry mob that had gathered outside demanded immediate justice. The territorial court system was still primitive in 1887, and in towns like Copper Ridge, the line between legal proceedings and mob rule was often blurred beyond recognition. Judge Blackwood, despite his obvious conflict of interest as both victim and presiding judge, insisted on hearing the case immediately. The trial, if it could be called that, lasted less than 2 hours, with witness after witness testifying against the brothers while no one spoke in their defense. Even Deputy Morrison, who had grown fond of the boys, seemed paralyzed by the overwhelming evidence and the pressure from the community leaders. The verdict was swift and merciless: guilty of grand theft and horse stealing, crimes that carried the death penalty under territorial law. Judge Blackwood's gavel fell with the finality of a coffin nail, and the sentence was pronounced with cold satisfaction. The brothers would hang at dawn the following day, their execution serving as a warning to any other drifters or criminals who might consider preying upon the good citizens of Copper Ridge. As night fell over the town, Samuel and Thomas sat in the cramped jail cell, holding each other close and whispering prayers they had learned from their mother before her untimely death. They had faced hardship before, but this time it seemed that their luck had finally run out completely. But fate, it seemed, was not quite finished with the Whitman brothers. As the first pale light of dawn crept across the desert landscape, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, a stranger rode into Copper Ridge on a magnificent Palomino mare. The man was tall and lean, with weathered features that spoke of years spent under the harsh southwestern sun, and his piercing blue eyes seemed to take in everything around him with the practiced gaze of someone accustomed to reading danger in the smallest details. He wore the typical garb of a rancher: well-worn leather chaps, a faded blue shirt, and a wide-brimmed hat that had seen better days. But there was something about his bearing that suggested he was no ordinary cattleman. His name was William James Thornton, though most people called him Will, and he owned the Iron Cross Ranch, a sprawling operation located about 50 miles southeast of Copper Ridge. Thornton had built his reputation as a fair but tough man, someone who demanded honesty from his employees and neighbors but was always willing to lend a helping hand to those in genuine need. He had served briefly as a Texas Ranger before moving to Arizona Territory, and his skills with both gun and rope were legendary throughout the region. What brought him to Copper Ridge on this particular morning was business. He had come to negotiate the purchase of breeding stock with a local rancher, but what he found would challenge everything he believed about justice and human nature. Thornton arrived just as the crowd was gathering around the gallows, their voices rising in an ugly chorus of bloodlust and righteous indignation. He pushed through the mob, his experienced eyes immediately focusing on the 2 young prisoners who were being led to their execution. Something about the scene struck him as wrong. The boys looked terrified but not guilty, their faces bearing the expression of innocence betrayed rather than criminals facing their just punishment. When he inquired about their crimes, several townspeople eagerly recounted the story of the stolen horse, but Thornton noticed inconsistencies in their accounts that seemed to have escaped everyone else's attention. As the executioner prepared to place the nooses around the brothers' necks, Thornton made a decision that would change everything. He stepped forward and demanded to examine the evidence against the accused, invoking an obscure territorial law that allowed any citizen to challenge a death sentence if they could provide reasonable doubt about the verdict. Judge Blackwood was furious at this interruption, but he was also a politician who understood the importance of maintaining the appearance of legal propriety, especially when challenged by someone of Thornton's reputation and standing in the community. Reluctantly, he agreed to postpone the execution for 24 hours while Thornton conducted his investigation. The rancher's first stop was the blacksmith shop, where he questioned Ezra Hutchins about his testimony. Hutchins repeated his story with confidence, describing in detail how he had seen the Whitman brothers leading a black horse out of town in the early morning hours. But as Thornton pressed for more specific information, cracks began to appear in the blacksmith's account. When asked about the exact time of his observation, Hutchins seemed uncertain, first claiming it was just before dawn, then changing his story to say it was closer to sunrise. More troubling still, when Thornton asked about the direction the boys had supposedly taken the horse, Hutchins pointed toward the east, but several other witnesses had claimed they saw them heading north. Thornton's next visit was to the scene of the alleged crime, Judge Blackwood's property on the hill above town. The paddock where Thunder had been kept was indeed secure, with high wooden fences and a sturdy gate that showed no signs of having been forced open. However, Thornton's trained eye noticed something that the earlier investigators had missed: fresh hoofprints leading away from the paddock in the opposite direction from where the Whitman brothers had supposedly been seen. The prints were deep and clear, suggesting a heavy horse moving at considerable speed, and they led not toward the roads out of town but toward the rocky terrain behind the judge's property. Following the trail proved to be challenging work, as the rocky ground retained few clear prints, but Thornton's experience as a tracker served him well. The hoof prints led through a maze of boulders and scrub brush, following what appeared to be an old cattle path that wound its way toward a series of natural caves hidden in the hills. As he rode deeper into this desolate landscape, Thornton began to suspect that he was not the first person to travel this route recently. Broken branches and disturbed vegetation suggested that others had passed this way within the last few days. The caves proved to be larger and more extensive than they appeared from the outside, forming a natural hideout that would be invisible to anyone not specifically searching for it. Inside the largest cave, Thornton made a discovery that changed everything. Fresh horse droppings, still warm to the touch, and the unmistakable signs that a horse had been kept here recently. But more important than these clues was what he found deeper in the cave system, a hidden chamber that had clearly been used as a storage area for stolen goods. Saddles, bridles, silver spurs, and other valuable items were stacked along the walls, representing what must have been months or even years of theft from ranches and travelers throughout the territory. But the most shocking discovery was yet to come. Hidden beneath a pile of blankets in the deepest part of the cave, Thornton found a leather-bound ledger that contained detailed records of every theft, complete with dates, descriptions of stolen items, and what appeared to be a distribution network for disposing of the goods. The handwriting was neat and educated, suggesting that the leader of this operation was no ordinary outlaw, but someone with significant education and organizational skills. As Thornton studied the entries, a disturbing pattern began to emerge. Many of the thefts had occurred on nights when specific people had alibis that could be verified, and the stolen goods often reappeared for sale in distant towns within days of their disappearance. Racing against time, Thornton rode back to Copper Ridge with his evidence, arriving just as the sun was beginning to set on what might have been the Whitman brothers' last day on Earth. He demanded an immediate meeting with Judge Blackwood and the town's leading citizens, presenting his findings with the methodical precision of a man accustomed to building legal cases. The ledger he had discovered contained entries that directly contradicted the testimony given against the brothers, and the physical evidence from the cave system painted a picture of a sophisticated criminal organization that had been operating under the noses of the local authorities for years. Judge Blackwood's reaction to Thornton's evidence was telling. Instead of the relief and gratitude one might expect from a victim whose stolen property had been located, the judge seemed agitated and defensive. He questioned the validity of Thornton's investigation, suggesting that the evidence might have been planted or that the rancher himself might be involved in the theft ring. But Thornton was prepared for such objections, and he had brought with him not only the physical evidence but also a witness, a young Mexican boy named Diego who worked as a shepherd in the hills and who had seen men moving horses through the area on multiple occasions over the past several months. Diego's testimony was devastating to the prosecution's case. The boy identified several prominent townspeople as being involved in the horse-stealing operation, including Deputy Marshal Morrison, who had supposedly taken the Whitman brothers under his wing out of charity. But the most shocking revelation came when Diego described the man he had seen directing the operations from horseback, a tall, distinguished figure who matched Judge Blackwood's description perfectly. The conspiracy was far more extensive than anyone had imagined, involving not just petty thieves but the very people entrusted with maintaining law and order in Copper Ridge. As the pieces of the puzzle fell into place, a darker picture began to emerge. Judge Blackwood had not been the victim of a random horse theft, but rather the leader of a criminal organization that had been systematically stealing livestock and other valuable items throughout the territory for years. The theft of his own horse had been carefully orchestrated to provide cover for the operation, allowing him to eliminate any potential witnesses, in this case, the Whitman brothers, who had unfortunately been in the wrong place at the wrong time and had seen something they shouldn't have. Their execution would have served multiple purposes: removing inconvenient witnesses, providing a public spectacle to reinforce Blackwood's reputation as a champion of law and order, and deflecting suspicion away from the real criminals. The revelation sent shockwaves through Copper Ridge, as citizens began to realize that they had been living under the rule of the very criminals they had trusted to protect them. Deputy Marshal Morrison, faced with overwhelming evidence of his guilt, broke down and confessed to his role in the conspiracy, revealing that he had been recruited into the organization after falling deeply into debt to Judge Blackwood. The blacksmith, Ezra Hutchins, had been coerced into giving false testimony through threats against his family, while several other witnesses had been paid for their cooperation or had been unknowing pawns in Blackwood's elaborate deception. The judge himself proved to be less cooperative than his subordinates. When confronted with the evidence against him, Blackwood maintained his innocence and accused Thornton of manufacturing evidence to protect the real criminals. But his protests rang hollow in the face of the overwhelming proof of his guilt, and when a search of his property revealed additional stolen goods, hidden in a secret compartment beneath his study floor, even his most loyal supporters began to abandon him. The man who had been ready to execute 2 innocent children for crimes he himself had committed was finally exposed for what he truly was, a calculating criminal who had used his position of authority to enrich himself at the expense of his neighbors. As dawn broke over Copper Ridge on what would have been the Whitman brothers' execution day, it was Judge Blackwood who found himself in shackles, awaiting transport to the territorial capital where he would face trial for his crimes. The irony was not lost on the townspeople, who had gathered once again around the gallows, but this time to witness the downfall of a man they had once respected and trusted. The evidence against Blackwood was overwhelming, and his conviction seemed certain, but the real victory belonged to Samuel and Thomas Whitman, who had been saved from an unjust death by the intervention of a stranger who had chosen to look beyond surface appearances and seek the truth. William Thornton's investigation had not only saved 2 innocent lives, but had also exposed a criminal network that had been plaguing the territory for years. The stolen goods recovered from the cave system were returned to their rightful owners, and several other unsolved thefts were finally resolved. The rancher's reputation as a man of integrity and courage was further enhanced by his actions, and he found himself in demand as both a mediator in disputes and an investigator of suspicious activities throughout the region. But for Thornton, the greatest satisfaction came from knowing that he had prevented a terrible miscarriage of justice and had given 2 young men a chance to build the honest lives they had always wanted. The aftermath of the Copper Ridge conspiracy had far-reaching consequences throughout Arizona Territory. The territorial governor ordered a comprehensive investigation into corruption within the local judicial system, leading to reforms designed to prevent future abuses of power. Several other communities discovered that they too had been victims of similar criminal organizations, often led by respected members of their own governments. The case became a cautionary tale about the dangers of placing blind trust in authority figures and the importance of maintaining vigilance against corruption even in the most unlikely places. For Samuel and Thomas Whitman, their near-death experience marked the beginning of a new chapter in their lives. William Thornton, impressed by their resilience and character despite their ordeal, offered them permanent positions at his Iron Cross Ranch, where they could learn the cattle business while continuing their education under the guidance of the ranch's schoolmarm. The brothers accepted gratefully, finally finding the stable home and father figure they had been seeking since their parents' deaths. Over the years that followed, they would prove themselves to be valuable members of the ranch family, eventually earning partnership stakes in the operation and becoming respected cattlemen in their own right. The town of Copper Ridge struggled to rebuild its reputation and restore trust among its citizens in the wake of the corruption scandal. A new judge was appointed by the territorial government, and honest men were elected to replace the corrupt officials who had been exposed by Thornton's investigation. The community implemented new safeguards designed to prevent future abuses of power, including regular audits of government activities and citizen oversight committees to monitor the actions of public officials. While the healing process was slow and sometimes difficult, the town eventually emerged stronger and more united than it had been before the crisis. Deputy Marshal Jake Morrison, despite his involvement in the conspiracy, was shown mercy by the territorial court due to his cooperation with investigators and evidence that he had been coerced into participating rather than acting as a willing accomplice. He was sentenced to 5 years in prison, but was released after serving only 2 years for good behavior and continued cooperation with ongoing investigations. Upon his release, Morrison left Arizona Territory entirely, seeking to start fresh in California, where his past would not haunt him. His wife Martha remained in Copper Ridge, where she became an advocate for orphan children and worked tirelessly to ensure that no child would ever again face the kind of injustice that had nearly claimed the lives of the Whitman brothers. Ezra Hutchins, the blacksmith who had given false testimony under threat, was treated more leniently by both the court system and the community. His cooperation with investigators and his obvious remorse for his actions led to a suspended sentence and community service. But the guilt of his near role in the deaths of 2 innocent children haunted him for the rest of his life. He became a vocal advocate for judicial reform and frequently spoke at community meetings about the importance of courage in the face of intimidation and corruption. His blacksmith shop became a gathering place for discussions about civic responsibility and the protection of individual rights. The story of the Whitman brothers and their miraculous rescue spread throughout the territory and beyond, becoming part of the folklore of the American West. Newspaper accounts of the case were picked up by publications as far away as New York and San Francisco, turning William Thornton into something of a celebrity and inspiring other citizens to take more active roles in ensuring justice in their own communities. The case was studied in law schools as an example of how corruption could infiltrate even the most trusted institutions and how individual courage could make the difference between justice and tragedy. Years later, when Arizona achieved statehood in 1912, Samuel Whitman was elected to serve in the first state legislature, where he championed laws protecting the rights of orphaned and abandoned children. His brother Thomas became a successful rancher and philanthropist, establishing a foundation that provided education and opportunities for disadvantaged youth throughout the Southwest. Both men remained lifelong friends of William Thornton, who had given them not just their lives but their futures as well. The Iron Cross Ranch became a symbol of integrity and second chances, attracting visitors from across the country who wanted to see the place where justice had triumphed over corruption. The legacy of that fateful day in Copper Ridge continued to influence the development of Arizona Territory and later the state of Arizona for decades to come. The judicial reforms implemented in the wake of the conspiracy helped establish a tradition of transparency and accountability in government that became a model for other Western territories and states. The case was frequently cited in legal precedents dealing with corruption, witness intimidation, and the protection of individual rights against abuse of governmental power. Law enforcement agencies throughout the West adopted new procedures for investigating crimes and handling evidence, partly inspired by the thoroughness of Thornton's investigation and the shocking revelations it had uncovered. The town of Copper Ridge itself underwent a remarkable transformation in the years following the exposure of Judge Blackwood's criminal organization. What had once been a community divided by suspicion and fear became known throughout the territory as a place where honest citizens could find fair treatment and equal justice regardless of their social status or economic circumstances. The town attracted settlers and businesses that might otherwise have chosen more established communities, drawn by its reputation for integrity and its commitment to protecting the rights of all residents. The annual Founders' Day celebration included a ceremony honoring William Thornton and commemorating the day when truth triumphed over deception and 2 innocent lives were saved from an unjust fate. The physical reminders of that dramatic day remained visible in Copper Ridge for many years. The gallows where Samuel and Thomas Whitman had nearly died was dismantled, and it was used to build a schoolhouse, symbolically transforming an instrument of death into a place of learning and hope. The cave system where Thornton had discovered the evidence that saved the brothers was turned into a museum and tourist attraction, with guided tours that told the story of the investigation and its importance in the development of the territory. Visitors could see the actual hiding place where stolen goods had been stored and examine replicas of the ledger that had exposed the conspiracy. As the 19th century drew to a close and the 20th century began, the story of the Whitman brothers became part of the broader narrative of the American West, representing the triumph of individual courage over institutional corruption and the importance of never giving up hope even in the darkest circumstances. The case inspired numerous books, plays, and eventually motion pictures, each retelling emphasizing different aspects of the story but all recognizing the central theme of justice delayed but not denied. The characters involved became archetypes of their respective roles. The sun was setting over the Iron Cross Ranch 30 years later, casting long shadows across the pastures where cattle grazed peacefully under the watchful eyes of experienced cowboys. William Thornton, now in his 70s with silver hair and weathered hands that spoke of a lifetime spent working the land, sat on the porch of his ranch house, a letter in his hands that had arrived that morning from the territorial capital. Samuel Whitman, now a respected state senator, had written to inform his old friend that the Arizona state legislature had voted unanimously to establish the Thornton Institute for Judicial Reform, a training center for judges and law enforcement officers that would ensure future generations would be equipped to prevent the kind of corruption that had once threatened to claim 2 innocent lives. Thomas Whitman had ridden over from his own successful ranch that afternoon, as he did every Sunday, to share dinner with the man who had saved his life and become like a father to him. The 2 men sat in comfortable silence, watching as the desert landscape transformed into a canvas of orange and purple hues, the same colors that had painted the sky on that fateful morning in Copper Ridge so many years ago. The scars of their near execution had long since faded, replaced by the confidence and dignity that came from lives well lived and purposes fulfilled. But neither man would ever forget the terror of standing on those gallows or the miracle of William Thornton's intervention at the crucial moment. The legacy of that day had grown far beyond anything any of them could have imagined. Copper Ridge had become a thriving city, its courthouse now home to a prestigious law school where students from across the nation came to study the case that had transformed American jurisprudence. The Whitman Foundation, established by the brothers with their success in ranching and business, had provided education and opportunities to thousands of orphan children throughout the Southwest, ensuring that no child would face the kind of desperate circumstances that had once driven 2 young boys to sleep in livery stables and accept charity from strangers who might not have had their best interests at heart. Judge Cornelius Blackwood had died in territorial prison 15 years earlier, his name becoming synonymous with judicial corruption and the abuse of power. His former mansion on the hill above Copper Ridge had been converted into a home for orphan children, a fitting irony that would have amused him had he lived to see it. The criminal organization he had led was completely dismantled, its members either imprisoned or driven from the territory, and the stolen goods recovered from their operations were returned to their rightful owners or used to compensate victims of their crimes. The impact of his downfall had rippled through the entire territorial justice system, leading to reforms that made Arizona one of the most progressive jurisdictions in the nation when it came to protecting individual rights and preventing corruption. Deputy Marshal Jake Morrison had indeed found redemption in California, where he became a respected peace officer in a small farming community, dedicating the remainder of his career to making amends for his past mistakes. He never returned to Arizona, but he corresponded regularly with Martha, his former wife, who had become one of the territory's most effective advocates for judicial reform and children's rights. Martha had remarried to a kind schoolteacher who shared her passion for social justice, and together they had established several schools throughout the territory that provided education specifically for disadvantaged children, including many orphans who might otherwise have faced the same desperate circumstances as the Whitman brothers. As darkness finally settled over the ranch, William Thornton folded Samuel's letter carefully and placed it in his shirt pocket, next to his heart. He had received many honors over the years, awards from law enforcement organizations, recognition from territorial and state governments, even a medal from the President of the United States for his contributions to justice reform. But none meant more to him than the simple fact that 2 innocent young men had been given the chance to live full and meaningful lives. The investigation that had saved them had taken only 24 hours, but its consequences had echoed through decades, touching countless lives and helping to build a more just and equitable society. Thomas rose from his chair and placed a gentle hand on Thornton's shoulder, a gesture of affection and gratitude that needed no words. In the distance, they could hear the sound of cattle settling in for the night and the soft murmur of ranch hands finishing their evening chores. The Iron Cross Ranch had prospered beyond Thornton's wildest dreams, but its greatest success was not measured in cattle or land or profit. It was measured in the lives that had been changed, the justice that had been served, and the legacy of integrity that would continue long after all of them had joined the generations of pioneers who had built this great territory into the state it had become. The story of that morning in Copper Ridge had become more than just a tale of crime and punishment, more than just an account of corruption exposed and justice served. It had become a testament to the power of individual courage in the face of overwhelming odds, a reminder that sometimes a single person willing to ask the right questions and follow the evidence wherever it leads can change the course of history. It demonstrated that true justice is not about revenge or retribution, but about protecting the innocent and ensuring that every person, regardless of their circumstances or station in life, receives fair treatment under the law. As the 2 men finally rose to go inside, where a warm meal and comfortable beds awaited them, they carried with them the satisfaction of lives well lived and purposes fulfilled. The gallows that had once threatened to end their story before it truly began had long since been reduced to kindling, but the memory of what they had represented, the potential for injustice and the importance of vigilance against corruption, would live on in the institutions and reforms they had inspired. The Whitman brothers had survived their brush with death to become pillars of their community, and William Thornton had proven that sometimes the most important battles are fought not with guns or violence, but with determination, integrity, and an unwavering commitment to the truth. In the years to come, as Arizona continued to grow and prosper, historians would look back on that day in Copper Ridge as a turning point not just for the territory but for the entire American justice system. The precedents established by Thornton's investigation and the subsequent reforms it inspired would influence legal procedures and judicial oversight for generations to come. The story would be told and retold, each version adding new layers of meaning and significance, but always returning to the central truth that had made it all possible, that in a land where justice sometimes seemed as scarce as water in the desert, there were still people willing to risk everything to ensure that right would prevail over might, and that innocent lives would be protected regardless of the cost.